Welcome back to another episode of Written for Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We're picking up in our sub-series and wrapping up this conversation about sacrifices and offerings, discussing today the priests and the sacrifices they offered in their own day. We've had two conversations up to this point regarding sacrifices and offerings, and I think it's valuable to just revisit some of those discussions so we're all on the same page. The first conversation we had was about the purpose for sacrifice and offering. And you'll recall from that conversation that there were some important points we brought up concerning the reason why God demanded sacrifice in the Old Testament. One of the reasons we discovered was that it was to bring to mind the cost of sin. So we remember that the offerer, when he brings the sacrifice, in many cases he plays a part in killing that sacrifice. We're talking specifically about an animal sacrifice here, so they'd be required, for example, to break the neck of a bull that they were offering. So there's a couple of ideas that are going on there. One being the cost that's extracted from them, because in those days livestock was extremely valuable. That was how many people made their living. So to take the best of the best they have in their flock or their herd and to bring that as an offering that they're giving to God as a sacrifice, that's one element of the cost. But then also having to participate in the offering of it, that's going to bring home an important truth about sacrifice as well. And for that matter, an important truth about the cost of sin. And then we also talked about the idea of atonement, being that sin is covered or forgiven. We had a conversation about that, and although we understand from the New Testament that animal sacrifice could never atone for sin, we still recognize that in the Old Testament it was said that it did forgive sin, and that's not a contradiction. It was all done in view of the sacrifice of Jesus, and that's how forgiveness would then be possible even in the Old Testament because of what Jesus was going to do. And even if it had not happened yet, the power of that sacrifice was enough to where it would apply even to those who lived before the time of Christ. So that's what we talked about in our first conversation regarding the purpose for sacrifice and offering. And then our last conversation we had, our most recent one, was about the place for these sacrifices and offerings. And you'll recall from that conversation we talked about the tabernacle as well as the temple, which were the only two places that Israelites were allowed to offer their sacrifices. Those are the only places that God said that they could do these things in those places. They could not offer sacrifice outside of that. And there were some reasons we talked about for that. We observed, for one thing, that the nations that were very idolatrous and pagan in their worship and in their religious practices, they would go and offer in all kinds of different places, thinking that somehow that would make them closer to God, when in fact that was not the case. And as another broader reason, we also discovered that the place for the sacrifice and offering, whether it be the tabernacle or the temple, was meant to be that reminder to the Israelites that God was among them, and that he was to be treated a certain way as one who was holy among them. So on that same track of thought, beyond the purpose and the place, now we're talking about the priests. And we need to make this point as crystal clear as we can right out of the gate, that not every Israelite was allowed to offer sacrifice to God. That's a self-evident truth that if you read through from Genesis to Deuteronomy, you'll find very quickly it was not for just any person to offer sacrifice. It was only given to one tribe, the Levitical tribe. And they were the ones, specifically the sons of Aaron, who were allowed to offer sacrifice and to be the ones serving in that particular capacity. Now, that does not mean that they were superior to others. In fact, there's many passages in the Old Testament and the law that talk about how it's not really a matter of superiority. It was God's design and decision to do this, and we'll talk about some reasons for that in just a little bit. But understand right off the bat that only the Levites and specifically the sons of Aaron were the ones who were allowed to do this. So every Israelite had to bring sacrifice. Every Israelite had to bring an offering, but they were not allowed to offer it themselves. Because again, it was God's design in his nation that the Levites be the ones to serve in that special way. And again, going to that same point, that just because they were a Levite did not mean they were allowed to do it either. They had to be a son of Aaron. We find very early in the book of Exodus, chapter 28, verse 1 specifically, that God told Moses, while he was on the mount receiving the commandments and the law and so forth, that it was to be the sons of Aaron and his sons at that time, who would serve as the priests. That was his decree and that was his design. From the very start, that was understood. And then we find also in a place like Numbers chapter 3, where God is even more explicit about how it's to be and who is to serve in this special way. In fact, I want us to go ahead and read this because I think this is a significant passage that happens very early in the book of Numbers and really establishes the reality and the authority of the Levites. Again, not of their own authority or their own accord, but of the authority that God bestowed upon them and the privilege that he gave to them, because, as he would say in another place, the Levites, and specifically the sons of Aaron, were his inheritance. Even though they did not have land of their own, they still had an inheritance in God. So let's go ahead and look at Numbers chapter 3 here. And let's read verses 5 on down to verse 13. I think this whole section is valuable to understand what's going on here. It pertains directly to the conversation about the priests and God's decision to make them the priests and to have them be the ones serving in that special way. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the tribe of Levi near, and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him. And they shall attend to his needs and the needs of the whole congregation before the tabernacle of meeting, to do the work of the tabernacle. Also, they shall attend to all the furnishings of the tabernacle of meeting, and to the needs of the children of Israel, to do the work of the tabernacle. And you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are given entirely to him from among the children of Israel. So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall attend to their priesthood. But the outsider who comes near shall be put to death." Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Now behold, I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. Therefore the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. They shall be mine. I am the Lord." So what is this passage telling us? Well, go back up to about verse 5 on down to about verse 9. It's very clear there that the tribe of Levi is going to be the one serving God in this special way in the tabernacle and later on the temple. So it goes back to that conversation we had about the place for sacrifice and offering. But notice the arrangement that God has here. It's Aaron, the priest, and his sons who are going to be the ones that are directing operations in the tabernacle and the temple. They are the ones who are given that authority and given that privilege to do this. The other tribes of Levi, there were 3 of them that are actually named later on in this chapter here in Numbers chapter 3, but they're going to be serving the sons of Aaron in different ways and carrying out the work of the tabernacle and arranging things a certain way. That's what's happening here in Numbers 3, verses 5 through 13. But again, this establishes very plainly, notice verse 10 for instance, that the sons of Aaron and Aaron himself are the only ones to be in the priesthood. I'm going to read it again just for a point of emphasis here. "So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall attend to their priesthood, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death." Now, the outsider in this particular case is not going to be someone from a foreign land, although that would apply here too. This is going to be someone from outside the tribe of Levi and outside the sons of Aaron. So let's say a son of Judah comes along, a member of that tribe, he wants to offer a sacrifice. According to this passage, he is to be put to death as one who tries to come near and take upon himself something that does not belong to him. That sounds harsh, and that sounds rough, but that's God's design in his nation for the priesthood. Because once again, it's important to understand that when you approach God, there's a certain reverence and a certain respect that attends that, and this illustrates that point very well. But I will make this note on that point about approaching God the right way, that just because someone was of the line of Aaron, and just happened to be born as a son of Aaron, that was not the only requirement for priestly service. And you might be scratching your head at that and wondering, because I just said that that was the requirement, that if you're going to serve as a priest, you have to be a son of Aaron. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And is that not enough? Well, no, it's not enough. There was more to it, and God had other expectations that were outside of one's lineage. So let's turn our attention to that point. Let's understand that if you're going to be one who offers sacrifices and offerings in the tabernacle and later on the temple, you have to be able to approach God a certain way. That's why we say on the slideshow that God demanded from the priest that they be a holy, sanctified people. And when we say those words and we look at it that way, we might put things together in a way that I don't intend and I don't think Scripture intends. We should understand right off the bat that coming before God as a holy and sanctified people does not mean that we're elevating ourselves above others. It's not a self-righteous attitude that we're demonstrating here. What we're talking about with holiness and sanctification is the idea of being close to God and of conforming ourselves and our lives to Him and what He expects of us. In other words, it's really not about us per se. It's about what we're doing to conform to what God desires from us. And our attitude ought to be humble in that respect and not to elevate self, but to rather understand that we're doing this because it's God's expectation for us. And also to that point, as I mentioned here on the slideshow, that the sons of Aaron in the Old Testament, the ones serving as priests, they had to treat the work God gave to them with reverence and seriousness. If they failed to do that, they were going to be in big, big trouble, as we're going to talk about. So God expects these people who are going to offer these sacrifices to be a holy, sanctified people, completely and wholly dedicated to Him and to what He wants from them. Let's consider that in further detail. Let's turn our attention, for instance, to Exodus chapter 29, verses 1 through 9. This is a small snippet of a larger text that talks about the process for setting apart the priests to serve God in the way that he expected from them. So, just to be clear about this before we even read the passage, here I am as a son of Aaron. I am a priest, or I have the ability to be a priest. And I stroll into the tabernacle. I make no preparation. I have no clue what I'm doing, but I'm there to serve. I might have the right attitude. I might have the right heart about things, and those details are important, by the way. I'm not diminishing that at all. But if I don't make the proper arrangements to serve God, I'm going to be in trouble. Even if my heart's in the right place, even if I'm doing things for the right reason, there's a certain procedure that has to be followed within the confines of what we're going to read. There had to be a process and a procedure in place for it to be understood as clearly as possible that there had to be dedication to God's service, and that's what we're going to find here in Exodus chapter 29, verses 1 through 9. So let's just read that together, and then I think you'll understand and put together what I'm trying to communicate here, because you'll see in this passage how important it was that the priests who were going to serve in that special way be prepared for this and be set apart for that purpose, even more so than others might have been. Let's just start in verse 1. And this is what you shall do to them to hallow them for ministering to me as priests. Take 1 young bull and 2 rams without blemish, and unleavened bread, unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers anointed with oil. You shall make of them wheat flour, or you shall make them of wheat flour, rather. You shall put them in 1 basket, and bring them in the basket, with the bull and the 2 rams. And Aaron and his sons you shall bring to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and you shall wash them with water. Then you shall take the garments, put the tunic on Aaron, and the robe of the ephod, and the breastplate, and gird him with the intricately woven band of the ephod. You shall put the turban on his head, and put the holy crown on the turban. And you shall take the anointing oil, pour it on his head, and anoint him. Then you shall bring his sons and put tunics on them. And you shall gird them with sashes, Aaron and his sons, and put the hats on them. The priesthood shall be theirs for a perpetual statute, so you shall consecrate Aaron and his sons. So apart from my issue there pronouncing that word in verse 9 about sashes, we understand what's going on here in this text, verses 1 through 9. It's a detailed and intricate preparation process before Aaron and his sons can actually even serve as priests to begin with. Just notice some of the details. They have to bring an offering, so they have to actually offer a sacrifice for themselves. And you're going to find that in many places in the law of Moses. You find that in places like Leviticus 16, for instance, that on the Day of Atonement, which is a very significant day within Israel, the high priest, before he can do anything else, he has to offer a sacrifice for himself. And that's similar to what you're seeing here, although this is more general. It's not just tied to one specific day. But this is setting Aaron and his sons apart to serve in this way. So they have to bring a sacrifice. And it's not just one thing or 2 things. It's a bevy of different things they have to bring, and it has to be prepared a certain way. You'll notice also, verse 4, they have to be washed with water. That's something, again, you'll see in Leviticus repeatedly, that they have to bathe in water and to be prepared for this service. They have to wear certain clothing to come before God and serve him. They have to have anointing oil, verse 7, put on them. They have to have other special garments that are put on them. The point that I'm getting at through all of this is that God demanded a holy, sanctified people, not only holy and sanctified in the way that they lived, in the way that they thought, but even in the way they appeared, even in the things they did that were outside of what we would typically think about. That's how significant the service of God is. That's how important this is to the Lord. So again, it goes back to the thought of seriousness, that if you're going to serve God in that special way, it is something to be treated with seriousness, not something that's lazy, not something that's casual, something that is dead serious. I'll make this point also. I did not put this passage on our screen here, but I'll just mention this in passing. I'd really encourage you to read Numbers chapter 18. So Numbers chapter 18 points out about the tithe that was to be given to the Levites, specifically the sons of Aaron. And the reason for that is that the sons of Aaron specifically, and really all of the tribe of Levi, because they were dedicated to God's service, they didn't have land inheritance. They would not have their own property. They would be among the other tribes in Israel. And more than that, they were not going to be doing the same work that all the other tribes of Israel would do. So someone who is a son of Aaron, for instance, he's not going to run a farm. He's not going to be someone who is wealthy. So the tithe, or the tenth is really what that means, was collected to support the Levites, not as a charity, but because what they were doing demanded that. If they were going to really be dedicated to God's service, the normal day-to-day activities that your average person participates in, Aaron and his sons are not going to do that anymore. Nor are any of the Levites really going to do that anymore, because they have much more important work that takes place within the tabernacle and later on the temple. So we have to understand that this was a commitment on the part of the priests. This was not just something that they did and just said, I'll just take it or leave it. This was serious. It was heavy. It was a major commitment on their part. And I'll just mention this in passing as well. In Leviticus chapters 21 and 22 specifically, if you read those chapters, you're going to come away with the understanding of the fact that there were also other requirements that went above and beyond your average Israelite that applied to the priests. So even beyond what we've already talked about, we even see there that God had expectations that when we read that might strike us as strange. But again, it all goes back to that point of God demanding a holy, sanctified people to serve him in his nation and in his priesthood. Now, along that same track of thinking, if you're a priest, you're a son of Aaron, you've got to be careful. So because you are part of a holy, sanctified people, because you are meant to come before God with seriousness and reverence, you have got to be exceedingly careful in all that you do. God provided specific and detailed instructions to his people in the law concerning how offerings were to be given. There is painstaking detail in the book of Leviticus, for instance, the first 8 chapters especially, about how these different offerings are to be conducted and what their purpose is and what specifically should happen, down to the sequence of the events. It is very detailed, very specific, almost to the point that we read it now and we think, man, this is a bit much. But that was pointing out to the Levites and the priests specifically that this is something God wants done a certain way, and you do not deviate from this. You don't go in this direction or that direction, just stay with what he gave you. And really the warning of that and the unfortunate circumstance that unfolds in Leviticus chapter 10 points out why this matters. We often talk about Nadab and Abihu in a lot of ways. I'm sure you've heard the example of Nadab and Abihu applied in any number of different areas about how we ought to worship properly and how we need to do things God's way, so on and so forth. And I think those are important points. But I think we need to understand what the text itself is saying about the issue that they experienced, and I think it goes right along with what we're saying. Let's just read Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3 here. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered, notice this, profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people I must be glorified. So let's just think about what's going on here. In verse 1, Nadab and Abihu offer up a profane fire. Well, what's a profane fire? We don't know all the specifics of what a profane fire is as far as the chemical mixture that they offered up or the particular substance they offered. But for something to be profane means that it's against God, that it's something that violates his holiness, that does not demonstrate or reflect something that is set apart. It's something common. For example, you think about Esau. He's referred to as a profane person. Well, it's not that he himself was a profane individual. It's the way that he carried himself. It's the way he lived his life. He was profane. He treated everything like it was common, like it meant nothing to him. Remember, we're talking about Esau. He's the one who gave up his birthright for a bowl of soup. So we can understand why he was not one who took things very seriously and treated blessings like they were meaningless. Well, think about now Nadab and Abihu and what they do here offering a profane fire. They treated God's service like it meant nothing. That really is the issue here. Now, again, there's points to be made about proper worship. There's points to be made about doing things God's way, and I think that does factor in here. But really what it comes down to is they treated the worship of God like it was something mundane, something common, something typical. They did not, as verse 3 says, when God responds to this, they did not regard God as holy. That was their first mistake, and unfortunately it was their last mistake. So that's the issue that's going on here. And back to our point about being exceedingly careful. That's why the priests, the sons of Aaron, when they came before God, they had to be very mindful of what they were doing and why they were doing it. They had to be mindful not only to do things the way God said to do it, but even to have the right mindset and motivation, to ensure they're not doing things just in a haphazard way, to ensure they're not just going through the motions without any sort of concern whatsoever for God's commands. They have to do things the right way and have a right mindset about what they're doing, where Nadab and Abihu did not. To that point, let's understand as we go down here to about verses 8 through 11, that God goes into further detail here with Aaron specifically. So obviously, Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's sons. He is quite disturbed about this, as we might expect. But God does give a bit more insight here into why this took place, and why it was something he took so seriously, and why their lives were unfortunately claimed. So let's just read verses 8 through 11 here. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses." So just think about what we just read there. They are to be a people, the sons of Aaron specifically here, are to be a people who teach by the way they live and by the way they act, by the way they speak. They are to teach Israel what God expects of them. And they are to approach God with a reverence and a severity that reflects that calling. They need to be people in verse 10 that can distinguish between the holy and the unholy, and the unclean and the clean, because they have to be able to show to the children of Israel what that actually means and why that matters. And that's one of the reasons why in verse 9 God says that you are not to participate in certain things that are going to cloud your mind and your judgment and make you do things you shouldn't do or act in ways you shouldn't act, lest you cause problems in the whole nation. So again, the whole point that we're getting at here is a simple one, that the priests had to be careful. They had to be mindful. They had to treat their work as something serious. It was not to be taken lightly. It was not something that was trivial, because the Levites, being priests in God's service, were in a privileged position, and they had to live in such a way that reflected that privilege. Now, having said all of that, I just want us to take a step back. We're a little bit over time here, but I hope you'll bear with me for just another moment or so. But let's just ask this question. Why in the world does this matter to us now? So we've talked about priests, we've talked about why they had to serve the way they did, and certain things they went through, and all of these different details. We don't have priests today. Now, there are some religious bodies that do, but we're not talking about them. But we realize that the Bible does not teach that in the time of Christ, and now in our age, which is the Christian era, as you might say, there's no teaching nor doctrine that says that there are priests in the sense that we find in the Old Testament. That just doesn't exist. That's not something that God expected nor commanded. So how does this actually matter to us? Because I think, just like we talked about with the place for worship in the previous conversation, as well as the purpose for animal sacrifice to begin with, there's lessons that we can still take away from this that do have a universal application at that time and even into our own time today. And I think one of the first lessons we can glean from that is one we've really been emphasizing here, that God's purpose behind the priesthood was to teach Israel that approaching him was not to be taken lightly. That if you're going to serve God, you've got to have a certain level of severity. You've got to have a certain level of seriousness in your mind about what you're doing. That this is not just something you're doing as a common activity. You're not just coming before him and it's routine, it's tradition, whatever the case may be, and you just don't care about it one way or the other. In other words, don't treat the service of God as something that is fast and loose. Treat it as something that is serious. Treat it as something that is really set apart in your life. That is what will make all the difference. And I believe that's the main purpose behind why the priesthood existed to begin with, is to show to God's people that his service is to be taken seriously. And that is still the case today. We don't have the priesthood around to teach that same lesson, but we have it in the Old Testament to teach that lesson to us all the same. There's something else that's embedded here that we didn't go into too much detail about, but we mentioned at the very beginning. Your average Israelite could not offer sacrifice. That was off the table. He simply could not do it. It was prohibited. That was only for the sons of Aaron. But think about how then they would understand the priesthood and the priests themselves. They would understand them to be mediators, or that is a go-between, between the person offering the sacrifice and God who would receive that sacrifice. But it shows there is a need for someone in the middle. And I believe in the New Testament we find that to be very quickly Jesus Christ, the one mediator between God and man. But the priesthood taught that lesson all the way back thousands of years before Jesus entered this earth. So we understand the need for a mediator based upon what we find in the priesthood. That there's a need for a go-between, that we need someone to intercede on our behalf and help us with our relationship with God. That we cannot do it on our own. We need someone to stand between us and the Lord to make that mediation, to make that atonement, and to make these things clear to us so that way we can be in right relationship with God. So we see these two lessons emerge regarding the priesthood. There's plenty of others we could talk about, but these are the two that I think stand out the most when it comes to why the priesthood existed and the lessons that they teach. Not lessons that they spoke out loud per se, but lessons that they modeled by the way they lived and by the fact they existed in that role to begin with. And these lessons have always been relevant. We have always needed to take the service of God seriously. We have always needed a mediator. These are truths that endure into our own day to day. So we might have Levites around today. They may not be serving in that way. We may not have priests, but we most certainly still need to have these attitudes we've described. We're out of time for today. I thank you for bearing with me again. I know it was a little bit of a longer episode, but hopefully this has been informative for you. We're going to stop here and pick up in our next discussions talking about the purpose for the law and really diving deep into what the law is intended to accomplish. And really understanding the law is not a bad thing. There's some statements in the New Testament that may give us that impression, but that's not the point. So we're going to talk about some of that and understand why did God give the law in the first place. But for now, I thank you for your attention, and once again, I hope this has been informative for you. Thank you.